My name is Marie Denon and I work for Big Green, and this presentation is part 2 of the Learning Garden Installation Instructional Series. Your garden should be set up and bolted together before you follow the instructions in this presentation. You'll find guidance for that process in How to Install Your Learning Garden Part 1. Watch that first if you have not done so already. This presentation will show you how to add soil to your garden, how to install a drip irrigation system, and how to connect your learning garden to a water source. We provide pictures, videos, text, and audio instructions to help you through the entire process. After you go through this presentation, you will be able to access the video recording to go back on your own and rewatch as needed when you install your garden. Today's presentation will walk you through 4 steps to help you finish installing your learning garden. The first step will show you how to fill your garden beds with soil. The second step will show you how to install your drip irrigation system. The third step will guide you to set up and attach your garden hoses, and the fourth step will help you connect your garden to the water source and go over some watering tips. This section will show you step by step how to fill your garden beds with the bagged potting mix you received. The pallets of soil you received are going to be wrapped. An adult should use a utility knife or a heavy-duty scissors to carefully cut off the plastic wrapping. Be careful not to cut through any of the soil bags. Don't unwrap the soil until you are ready to fill the garden beds, because the wrap protects the soil from rain and will prevent the bags from getting wet and waterlogged. Make a plan for moving the soil ahead of time. If you have a class of students, it will not take too long to move the soil to your garden beds. If your soil is very far away from your garden, you might want to borrow a wheelbarrow or a utility cart to help move the soil to the garden. Be careful of your back when lifting the soil, and remember to bend and lift with your legs. Adults or older students can carry one bag at a time, and younger students should have a buddy when carrying a bag of soil. This video shows high school students carrying the soil bags closer to the garden. You have received the amount of soil you need to fill up your garden beds. Divide up the soil evenly between all of the beds. Some of your garden beds might be different sizes, and divide your soil accordingly based on the size of the beds. I recommend, as bags are carried to the garden, they are rested standing up alongside the beds. This way you can keep track of how many bags you are going to put in each garden bed. Resting them on the side of the garden will also make them easier to tip into the garden beds when you are ready to fill the beds. The video on this slide shows students placing soil next to the garden beds. There are 2 ways you can dump the soil into the garden beds. The first way is to cut the bags first and then tip them into the beds. The second way is to place some garden bags in the garden bed, cut the bags at the bottom, and then just lift up the bags and the soil will fall in. When you are ready to dump the soil into the garden using either method, make sure an adult uses a utility knife or a heavy-duty scissors to cut open the bags. Be mindful to only open the bags that are needed. You might have extra bags of soil and you don't want them opened until they are ready to be used. You can go back and cut more bags open as needed. When filling the garden beds, you want to fill them all the way to the top, as the soil will settle about 2 to 3 inches in the first season when watering and as natural weathering of the soil takes place. This video shows a student gently spreading out the soil in the garden bed. You can do this frequently as you add soil to the garden. You want to make sure to spread the soil to the edges and corners of the garden beds to evenly distribute the soil and remove air pockets. And remember, if you received more soil than fits in your garden beds, that is okay. You can save those bags to top off your garden at a later date in between your next growing season. The next section will go over how to install the drip irrigation system into your garden beds. In the next 2 slides, I will go over the drip irrigation parts so you are familiar with each of the parts and how to use them. The brand name that makes this specific product is called Netafim. This slide shows each part that you have received with your learning garden. The drip tubing is what you will cut to size and lay down in your garden beds. The barbed pieces you received will be inserted into the drip tubing. The barbed elbow and barbed T are used to make the end piece that is placed at the end of the garden bed. The coupler is used to make repairs in the drip tubing, and the end caps close off the drip tubing when they are laid in the garden beds. The barbed to 3/4 threaded piece is used to attach your drip irrigation end piece to the garden hoses and the water source. You might have been given long irrigation end pieces that are already put together. If that is the case, the barbed elbow and barbed T pieces won't be loose, as they will already be assembled into a completed end piece ready to install into your garden beds. If this is the case, the only loose pieces you received will be barbed to 3/4 threaded pieces and end caps, and you might have received some couplers in a spare parts bag. The next slide will show some more instructions for how to make your end piece and how to use some of these specific irrigation parts. I am going to show you how the Netafim pieces work together and how to connect the parts properly. This is a skill you should review, as you will need to know how to do this when you are installing the drip tubing into your learning garden beds. We recommend you watch this video with students ahead of working together in the garden to install your irrigation. The barbed ends of the Netafim pieces, like these, connect to the drip tubing. And there are considerations you'll need to pay attention to when connecting these pieces. First, whenever you are going to connect one of these pieces to the drip tube, you want to make sure that you have cut the Netafim at least about 2 inches away from one of these emitter holes. There is an emitter every 6 inches along your drip tubing, and this is where the water is released through the tube, and you can see them as holes in the drip tubing. If you cut too close to the emitter, the barb fitting won't have room to fit into the drip tubing. And I will demonstrate what happens if you cut too close to the emitter. You actually can see that the piece of the emitter will get in the way and you won't be able to stick the barbed end into the irrigation tube. You also want to make sure that whenever you are cutting the drip tubing, before you're going to insert a barbed piece, that the cuts are very clean and very straight. That will ensure that the barbed pieces stay in place when you insert them. To insert a barbed piece, you will need to wiggle and twist the barbed fitting until it is fully inserted. You want to wiggle the piece as far as you can into the drip tube. And this can take a little bit of effort on your hands. In cold weather, it's especially difficult to work with the stiff tubing, and you can warm the pieces by placing the ends of the tube in warm water or using a little bit of soapy water to lubricate the fittings, and this will make it a lot easier to wiggle them into place. The next part I want to show you how to use is the end cap. The end caps are used to secure the drip tubing when they're installed in the garden bed and to prevent them from leaking, to prevent water from just continuing to run out the end of the drip tube. So you use these by placing the drip tube through one hole, and then you'll bend the irrigation tube, and then you place the bent end through the other hole, and that secures the end of the drip tube. The next piece I'm going to show you how to use is the coupler. This is a straight piece with barbed ends that you can use if one of your emitters bursts, or if there is a crack or something happens to your drip tube that is causing it to leak. rather than you having to replace the entire drip line, you can just replace the part that is broken. So you would do that by cutting out the broken part, and then using the coupler to reattach the drip line to itself. And you can see there, they are sometimes a little bit hard to get on, but just keep wiggling and applying pressure and they will attach themselves. Now I am going to show you how to make an irrigation end piece. You may have already received these pieces put together with your garden beds, but if you did not receive them put together, this is what you will need to do, and this video will also be helpful to you in case your end pieces break in your garden. This will show you how to make a new end piece or repair the broken parts. You will need one completed end piece for each standalone section of garden beds you have. It will go inside of your learning garden beds at one end where the garden hose will attach to the drip irrigation. You will need heavy-duty scissors to cut the drip tubing. You will be cutting 3 short pieces of drip tubing, and these will be used with 2 barbed tees, 1 barbed elbow, and 1 barbed to 3/4 threaded piece. You will cut 2 of the drip tubing pieces 10 inches long, and they should have 2 emitters within that 10 inches and about 1.5 to 2 inches on the end, on the other side of the emitters. And then you will cut 1 short piece that has no emitters. That should be about 4 inches long. In total, the end piece will end up being about 26 to 28 inches long when you put it in your garden bed. I'm going to show you how to cut these pieces and use the barbed ends to make your own end piece right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab my irrigation. You always want to assess where your emitters are before you get started. And I'm going to cut about 2 inches away from this emitter here. And then I'm going to cut about 2 inches on the other side of the second emitter. So that's my first piece right here. And then I'm actually going to use this piece and line it up with the 2 emitters on the next piece of drip tubing. And I'm going to need to cut a little bit off of one end so it's lined up. And then I'm going to cut it where it's lined up on the other end. So here's my 2 pieces. And then I need to cut the end piece that's going to go on the end. And how I do that is I just cut close to one of the emitters. I cut off the piece, and then I'll cut inside where the other emitter is. On the inside, on the other side. So there's no emitters on this piece. The first thing I do is it's very easy to draw pieces. The first thing I do is take one of your T pieces and I attach the 2 longer pieces to each other. And then you'll attach a T piece on where one of the other long pieces is, and you attach the short piece. So you should have your 2 long pieces, your short piece, and then on the other end of the long piece, that's where you attach the barbed elbow. So you want to make sure the short piece stays open T, L, T, long piece, T, long piece, elbow. And this is probably 28 inches long because this piece is a little longer, but that's okay. In the garden bed, I will lay this down in the garden bed and I wait to attach the end piece. So this is the piece that goes on the end of the short piece, but I wait until this is laying in the garden because I might need to shorten this, and then I will attach this piece on in the garden before I attach this to the hoses. Before you begin installing your drip irrigation, you need to identify which sides of your garden beds you want your hoses attaching to the garden. You will be drilling holes in the sides of the garden beds where the hoses attach to the drip line. It is very important to think about this setup ahead of time. You don't want extra holes drilled in your new gardens. In order to figure out the best placement for your hoses, you want to identify where you will set up the splitter in relation to the main water source. This slide includes a diagram that shows how this garden has the hoses set up in relation to the main water source, finding the most direct pathway and using the shortest hoses. You can move on to the next step once you figure out where you want your hoses and the splitter set up, and where they will connect to the learning garden. You will need your drill and the 3/4 inch drill that you use to drill the irrigation drip line holes for this next part. You are going to be drilling holes in the sides of your beds where you will lay your irrigation end piece, which will then connect to your shorter hoses. You need to drill the holes about 3 inches below the top of the garden bed or just under the lip of the garden bed and 2 inches in from the side of the garden bed. You will need to move some soil away from that area to properly drill the holes. And then make sure you discard any plastic pieces that are shredded after you drill the holes. This is where you will lay down your irrigation end piece, and it's also where the shorter hose will attach to your garden bed that will feed into the splitter. In the next step, you will be measuring the drip tubing that will get laid down in the garden beds, which will attach to your end pieces and the hoses. The next slide will show you a video walking you through how to measure and lay down your drip irrigation. You will be repeating this next process 3 times for each section of connected beds in your garden. This video is going to show you measuring out and laying down 1 of the drip tubes, but you will be laying down 3 per garden bed. To measure your drip tubing, start at the end of the bed where you drilled the hole on the side of the bed where you want to attach your hose. Start with the outer, which is also the longer curve of the garden bed. Have 2 to 3 people line up on the outer curve and slowly start to unravel the irrigation tubing. As you unravel the coil, hand it down the line to the people helping you. Try your best to keep the tube together in a coil so it doesn't get tangled. Once you get to the end of the garden bed, unravel about 6 more inches and then cut the hose off at the beginning part of the coil. Make sure to cut in the middle of 2 emitters in the tube. And make sure to cut a very clean and straight line where you cut the drip tube. This will ensure you have enough space to attach the bar pieces to the end piece. Next, have 2 people take either end of the cut drip line and pull on it gently like a gentle tug of war. This stretching will help the drip line lay flat without too much of a curve. After the drip line is straight, bring the whole piece to the side of the garden bed where you started to unravel it, and you will start to feed the tube through the holes that you drilled where 2 beds are attached, starting at the end of the bed where you are going to lay your irrigation end piece and where you drilled the holes for the hoses. Feed the tube through the outer hole that you drilled along the top of each of the garden beds. As the hose is laid across the beds, continue to thread it through the corresponding outer curve of each section of the garden. You will need to move some of the soil near the holes away to be able to feed the tube through the hole. Be careful to not drag the open end of the tubing through the soil. If some soil does get in the tube, you can shake it out as you go along. Continue to pull the tube through all the holes on the outer edge of the bed until you get to the very end of the garden bed. You will repeat this entire process 2 more times, measuring and laying the drip line through the center holes and the inner holes. You will, at the end of this process, have 3 parallel lines of drip tubing running through the entire connected system of garden beds. This slide is showing you 2 things to watch out for when measuring and laying down the drip tubing. When you're pulling out the drip tubing to measure the length of the garden beds, make sure to spin the coil slowly and release the tubing in a way that doesn't bunch it or cause it to tangle. You don't want what happened in the picture on the left. A tangled drip line makes it very difficult to unravel the coil. If this does happen, move very slowly to carefully detangle the line so you don't kink or pinch the drip tubing. You may need to unroll the whole line to fix a badly tangled coil. It's worth going slowly to prevent it from happening in the first place. The next picture shows the drip tubing not lying along the natural curve of the garden beds. If your drip tubing looks like the picture on the right, you need to gently smooth out the soil and then twist the tubes around through the holes in the beds until they lay flat and follow the curve of the garden bed. You want to do this before you attach the drip tubing to the irrigation end piece, because it will be harder to twist and straighten when attached to the end piece. After you have measured and laid down all of the drip lines in the garden, you can then connect the irrigation end pieces. The end pieces will connect to the 3 drip tubes in the garden and will connect to the hose on the outside of the garden. Lay the irrigation end piece down in the garden bed and pull the end piece that has the short piece of tube with no emitters through the hole you drilled on the side of the garden bed. The side of the end piece with the barbed elbow should be inside the garden bed at the other end. Next, attach each of the 3 drip tubes to the associated 3 barbed fittings in the end piece. Make sure you attach the end piece on the inner, middle, and outer curves to the barbed piece that aligns with those drip tubes. Double check that you are attaching the correct drip tube to each barbed end, or the lines will get crossed. The only way to fix a crossed line is to carefully cut the tube off at the barbed fitting and start over. This video is showing you how to connect the drip tubing to the irrigation end piece. You will notice I am cutting the drip tube 1 more time before I attach it to the end piece. I do this sometimes if I don't think the irrigation has a clean and straight cut. Sometimes when you cut the irrigation, when it is being unraveled and uncoiled, you might be cutting very fast, and then when it is time to attach it to the end piece, it might need a fresh cut. There is a pause after I attach the first 2 because I have asked the students to straighten out the irrigation hose and line it up with the curve of the garden bed at the other end. This video is showing you how to connect the drip tubing to the irrigation end piece. You will notice I am cutting the drip tube 1 more time before I attach it to the end piece. I do this sometimes if I don't think the irrigation has a clean and straight. After you have attached the 3 drip lines to the irrigation end piece, you can then feed the end of the piece through the hole you drilled. You might need your heavy-duty scissors for this next step. Make sure the irrigation end piece is in line with the end and the edge of the garden bed. The end with the barbed elbow should be resting on the inside corner of the bed, and make sure the drip tubes are lying flat on the surface of the soil. Notice the end piece that is coming out of the hole and how far it is sticking out. You can trim it so the end of the end piece is closer to the side of the bed, but you do want this piece sticking out a little bit. Although if it sticks out too much, it might kink and over time will break when you attach the hose. Once the end piece is trimmed to the correct length, you can attach the barbed to 3/4 threaded piece. Wiggle the fitting fully into the end piece. The last step for installing your drip irrigation is to close off the drip tubing at the end of the irrigation bed opposite the irrigation end piece. This will stop the water from flowing out of the end of the drip tubes and direct the water out of the emitters. You will need 3 end caps for each garden bed. Make sure the drip tubing is laying flat and matching the curvature of the garden beds before you get started. Begin by inserting one drip tube into one of the holes of an end cap. Slide the end cap up the drip tube and bend the drip tube to kink it as close as you can at the end of the garden bed. Feed the folded end of the drip tube back through the other hole of the end cap, and then slide the end cap back down as far as you can towards where the drip tube is kinked towards the end of the garden bed. This completes installing the drip irrigation. The last section of this presentation will show you some tips for watering your garden and using your irrigation system. In the first couple weeks after you plant seeds in your garden, you'll want to top water with your nozzle to make sure the soil stays wet and moist enough to help germinate the seeds. The drip irrigation is not effective when germinating newly planted seeds because it doesn't evenly water the surface of the soil and will lead to inconsistent germination. Once the seeds start to sprout, or if you planted seedlings in your garden, then you can use your drip irrigation system. Congratulations! After watching part 2, you should have everything you need to install your learning garden at your school. Make sure to visit our website at www.biggreen.org, where we have lots of gardening resources that can help you in your school garden. We also have some free curriculum opportunities on our website, and at the bottom of the website there is a link for you to subscribe to our newsletter. I encourage you to do that, and you can keep up with new opportunities that might come up at Big Green and stay in touch.